do you want to handle questions, Jonathan?
Anybody has a question? Raise your hand. One thing that we've done this Woods in Your Back Shop workshop for a couple of years now after we developed these materials, and this was developed in cooperation with Penn State and Virginia. So these workshops are going on throughout a three-state area as well as other areas. The thing I've learned over the years is that many folks think too small. They think about wildlife or about forestry. They're thinking about a tree, and a tree really doesn't make any difference. Okay, when we start talking about managing larger acreages, you need to think bigger, okay? Not just about planting trees and shrubs, not just a few, but thinking from micro to macro, kind of designing a system. And one thing I want to try and get through to you is that idea. Google Earth is a great tool for that because you can actually look at your entire property and say, oh, I can take this area perhaps and allow this to go into a natural area, or this is connected to some habitat next door and things like that. This whole landscape level viewing approach that we have with the new technology is just great. But I'm asking you because many folks are just thinking too small, not just a little area like this. You need to, if you really want to have some impact, you need to think bigger, okay? And I kind of made that point with like invasives, Sure, I can go out and pull a few weeds, but that's not going to do anything unless I can affect a larger area. In the case of invasives, judicious use of herbicides. I'm not saying spray everything, but use them appropriately, okay? As well as with planning, looking at larger areas, tying into existing natural areas that are out there. And so that's just a kind of a message to think about as we get into this. When you start looking at your own property, try and think bigger than you might otherwise, okay? So Connie talked a little bit about this, but what we've seen trends in terms of ownership of woodland throughout the state of Maryland and many areas throughout the Northeast and around the country is an increasing number of woodland owners as these larger tracts have gotten broken up. Owners with different ownership objectives, a lot more with wildlife and aesthetics and things like that. And we even found the words we use are important. If I were to ask you who here has a forest on their property, what would most people say? If they have a forest on their property? We found in a lot of the testing we did, yeah, I have some woods on my property. So that's why we call the woods in your backyard. And we're not talking just about forest or woodland. We're even define it down to natural areas. There's all kinds of natural areas, and they serve a similar function. This alludes to some of what Connie said, is that when you look at private ownership of woodland in the state of Maryland, okay, 78% or 75, whatever you want the numbers, of our forest or woodland is owned by private landowners, folks just like yourself. And in 1976, there were 95,800 private owners. 55% of them owned from 1 to 9 acres. All right? So the rest owned larger tracts. As land development has taken place throughout the state, in 1989, we had more owners, 131,000, and that increased to 65% of the total ownerships. To the point now, in 2006, Connie said 75, depends how you look at the numbers, 85 if you just look at forest owners that aren't in trusts and things like that, but 156,000 landowners, 85% under 10 acres. And that was really the rationale for developing the woods in the backyard, because I used to do a lot of traditional forestry programs, managing timber and wildlife and larger acreages, commercial harvests. Well, just from the cross-section of this room, this is very representative of the cross-section of woodland ownership in the state today. So many folks are not going to have access to a professional forester. So we developed a self-assessment manual along with some of these materials so that folks can go out and learn more about their property and get some ideas on things they can do. Does that make sense? All right? So landowners are part of the solution. And I guess the message I'm making is that everybody says, well, I own 5 acres of land. That doesn't mean anything. Well, the fact is that the future of Maryland's forests depends on private owners just like yourselves, because you make up 78% of them. And it's the collective actions of all small owners just like yourself that's going to be the future of Maryland forests, not the government. The government owns a little over 20%. The large majority is owned by private folks just like yourself. So as much as possible, I'll say this later, encourage you to work with your neighbors. Now, does everybody like their neighbors? No. Some of them, okay? So you want to work with the neighbors that you can work with, okay? So the purpose of this Woods in Your Backyard course is kind of dual. It's this whole focus on transitioning mowed areas to natural use. Does this look familiar for any of you? Okay. All right, and with the cost of mowing lawns and everything else, and people don't want to spend their entire weekend on a lawnmower, they're saying, how do I do it? And what I've found is with some of the information we're going to provide you, you'll have a better knowledge base, you'll feel more empowered to go out there and do something. And the one message I'm going to give you out of this workshop is to go out and do something, experiment. It's okay. It's not, you're not going to, kill the world here. The other side of that is you have existing natural areas. Well, how do I improve those? So that's what we're going to talk about today. All right. The manual is basically divided into 5 parts. The first part, it's kind of like we talk about forest stewardship planning or woodland stewardship planning. You have a plan. You look at what's there, and then you set some objectives, and you say, what are some of the actions or projects I can do to reach those objectives over the next so many years? Well, that's kind of how the book is laid out. It starts off, getting you to, with an introduction, looking at your interests and what you know, what you want out of the property. Then it gets you out there doing a series of activities, gives you some information through a lesson, and then it gives you an activity for you to go out and do in the field, in your property. And you can, this is meant to fold back on itself so it can go out in the field, and you can use it that way. And then part 3, probably the part that many people maybe get more out of than anything, is this whole idea of understanding the basic ecological principles that underlie why and how woodlands develop. All right. Who has any background here in ecology or forestry? Well, this isn't unusual because a lot of the audiences I deal with, people know about a lot of things. They know about computers. They know about fixing cars. They know about, I don't know, tending to a garden. But when it comes to understanding how natural forests or natural systems work, that's a little fuzzy. And a lot of folks come out of our programs understanding, oh, that's why that happens. And I hope you'll get some of that out of this day. The final thing is looking at basic, continuing that learning process on your property, but then tying in projects like you see here. Choosing projects, realizing you don't know what those projects are. We kind of spoon feed you a lot of this through a table system, okay? Kind of like, giving you some information, saying, well, these are some of the projects people do to reach some of these objectives, all right? And then some samples, and then with part 5 is like basically an empty workbook with all those empty activities so that you can do them on your own. And again, if you look on your agenda on the back, you'll see where you can go online. It's password protected, and these are all in Word form, so you can actually download all these activities, and then you can type in the information. All right? And then we have some appendices and things like that. So we have a learning approach, a lesson, a hands-on activity, activity sheets, and what you end up with is the basics of a woodland or a forest stewardship plan with some ideas on what to do. All right? The conceptual framework of this whole idea is kind of looking at your property as 3 types of land use. All right? You have intensive use areas like you see here, with, I'm pressing the wrong button. Buildings, sheds, paved areas. Then you have intermediate areas, which are your lawns and pastures. And then you have existing natural areas. Some of those are mowed, some of those are just old fields, whatever. And this is actually my property. These are 3-acre lot. That's my neighbor's lot. You notice the difference? When we moved in, this was all cornfield. I never mowed back here. I never planted grass. So this is all natural area back here. Can you see that, or is that hard to see? You can see that in the back? Okay. So after 20 some odd years, we have a very different landscape. We have a lot of wildlife. In fact, my tree stand is right there. Okay. And this is what it looked like. This is what it looked like after 3 years, looking into the backyard from the house as this grew up, and I had a trail that I had established through there. All right. And this is what it looked like 16 years later. So that's natural succession. That's the continuing development of different forest communities on top of each other. And like I said, one thing I did throughout this was I had a backpack sprayer with Roundup, and I consistently, as it went through various stages, first it was thistle and things like that, then later on it was tree of heaven, and honeysuckle. Honeysuckle finally got me though. Never could control that. So, but we got rid of the worst of it. Okay. So this whole the manual kind of covers, follows a case study, the Nelson family. And one of the things we're going to have you do as a small group is have you draw a map of your property. And you say, I don't know if I can do that. It's amazing the detail that people, if you give them a piece of paper, that they can really draw about their property. So we'll have you do that a little bit later. The other thing is identifying what your interests are. And we kind of came up with this idea of an interest table, saying that as a property, you have certain human values, what you want out of the property. Income's probably not a big issue for a lot of you folks, but enhancing property values, trees enhance property values, right? Satisfaction, privacy, reduce lawn mowing, and then you have like resource things like forest health or products, natural area improvement, wildlife habitat, and so on. And what I'd like you to do is when we have a breakout is try to pick out which of these boxes are your primary objective, your secondary, and your third base objective. What are the combination of those things that really interest you the most, and kind of come up with a verbal description of what that is. And I have an example here, so that this person wants to reduce lawn mowing and wildlife habitat, all right? Just off the back of your head, could you think of some type of a project that would help do that? What kind of thing do you think you could do if that was really your primary objective? I want to reduce lawn mowing, and I want to increase wildlife habitat. Huh?
I was going to say, did you just stop mowing?
Okay, I could stop mowing, and I'm going to create habitat, aren't I? All right? Exactly. I could plant trees. I could do a number of things. And this is just an example, but yeah, reduce the time spent mowing the lawn and improve wildlife habitat. Now, this sounds simple. And the second one is improve the water quality of Oak Creek. Have Oak Creek do that. And finally, improve aesthetic enjoyment and sense of privacy. The point here is that these are some objectives or overall goals, right? So this is kind of drives your actions a little bit later. And I know this sounds simplistic, but believe it or not, this is really important. Kind of say, oh, that's really kind of what I'm interested in. And then you start thinking about projects and things that you can do that are going to drive towards those goals, which can always change as well. Does that make sense? Okay. What are some examples of natural area improvement, of those different resource objectives? Well, it could be planting trees. It could be controlling invasive exotics. It could be thinning the trees out so that other trees are allowed to grow. Those are all options. How about forest products? I'm interested in products. Who here cuts any firewood? Okay. All right. So one question that comes up, which trees do you cut for firewood? Live trees or dead trees? Dead? Dead. That's wrong. Well, it's not wrong. One thing, just keep this in mind. The one opportunity you have when you have a chainsaw in your hand is to alter the wood, is to alter the composition of the forest. And it's good to leave some dead trees for woodpeckers and other types of things. So you want to leave some, okay? Maybe like 3 to 5 per acre or something like that if you can. But the real opportunity you have with firewood is that you can cut live trees so you can allow other trees to grow. And that's when you can get rid of those damaged trees or ones that are like ones that you don't want there. So, because then those other trees are going to grow in and take that space. Now I'm the same way. I do cut dead trees too. But just think about that. If you have the time and the time for the wood to cure, because you can make real changes in the composition of your woodland by cutting live trees. All right. Maybe that's anathema. I don't know if it's people think that's heresy, but it's true. We'll get into that later. There's other things like ginseng and stuff. I don't know if anybody's gotten into that, but grapevines, mushrooms. Wildlife habitat, creating rock or brush piles, encouraging wildlife food trees, creating shelter opportunities, soft edge, like I said, allowing the edge of the forest to grow out perhaps into an open area that you get more diverse vegetation.
I do have an issue, and there's a lot of the owner previous to me on the farm, he sort of just took brush and put it in different piles all over the place. Is there like best practices for how to deal with brush in terms of?
Yeah, yeah. One of the things in here talks about how to properly construct a brush pile, And the way you do that is the way people don't do it, okay? Because the whole point of a brush pile is that the critters and stuff can go into it and have a place to hide. So typically what you do is you put your bigger logs on the bottom so that things can run into that and hide, mammals, small mammals and stuff like that. And then you put the fine material on the top. But what most people do is they cut down trees, they pile all the fine stuff, and then they throw all the big logs on top to keep it down. So a properly constructed brush pile actually has the wider stuff on, bigger stuff on the bottom, kind of like a log cabin type thing on the base, and then cover it up with brush so that predators can't get in there.
Is it better to have one big one or 3 little ones?
Wildlife people say it's better to have one big one. Yeah, because we had for one of our workshops, wildlife, I can't remember, it was Jim Mullen, I think. We had constructed some brush piles for demonstration. He goes, oh man, people do that all the time. He said, make one big one. So that was the first time I heard that.
Yeah, we saw they kind of.
So I'm just telling you what a wildlife biologist told me. Water resources. A lot of people have erosion along their stream corridors and things like that. There's opportunities for stabilizing those boundaries and things like that. Not easy to do in some cases. Protecting spring seeps. Those are high-use wildlife areas. Recreation, creating trails. I get calls from people, well, I have 4 acres of woods. Well, you ever been in there? No. There's no way to get into it. One of the first things you can do to really enjoy your woods better is to actually lay out and construct a trail. Not a straight one, make it wind around a little bit, if there's any scenic things, or, you use some, like you see trails. No trails are straight, right? You want them to wind around. So in one of the activities in there is kind of the constraints to management, because one of the things that comes up, well, I'm a part of a homeowner association, and I'm not allowed to let the weeds grow more than 12 or 18 inches. And this is, a lot of covenants are changing, but I would say that one thing you're going to get out of this manual, if you are in that situation, is that if you go to a homeowner association with a plan, you're not the crazy guy in the bathrobe walking around the property in the day, it's just crazy guy. You actually have an idea of something you want to do, and in this case, it made the compromise that they actually mowed back 25 feet from the road or something like that. But the idea that this at least gives you some credibility on something you're trying to encourage to do. Okay, getting to know your property, how you lay in the landscape, and again, like I said, Google Earth is just a great thing for this. Okay, and one thing you want to think about is on your property. This is the typical layout of a lot of properties right here, especially back in the 50s and 60s. You had a house, quarter-acre lot with a tree. And most properties now are developed where you have these, abutting back areas where you have larger woodland areas. And that should always be your goal in general. When you start thinking about establishing natural area, always try and tie on and enlarge existing natural areas. Instead of creating an island, now you may have to do that sometimes, but try and build out from an existing woodland, because you're just going to increase the size of that natural area. And that's going to provide more habitat. Does that make sense? Okay. And it just looks like this. This is a development in Baltimore County. You can see this is down at the bottom of this hill here. This is a development, large lot development. And these are tree shelters. But basically, this is all going back into natural area. They still have a nice mowed area up top. But again, if you live in a property like this, try and tie into some existing forested or natural areas that are there. Always a basic principle. Who here has used Google Earth to identify their property? Okay. Again, this is a bad thing, but it's just where we are now. But again, you can see where you are in the landscape. You can see where there are open fields, perhaps, that lie around you, where perhaps you can helps you see where wildlife might be traveling and habitat that you might have that other people don't have. How about soil surveys? Anybody know what a soil survey is? Most people, a few people. These have been published for a long time, and basically these have been done by the Natural Resource Conservation Service pretty much for everywhere, but it's all online now. If you just type in web soil survey, you can actually find your property, and it'll print out a map that will tell you all the soils on your property, and you can dig deeper, and it'll tell you about the characteristics of those soils, how fertile they are. It'll even give you some, in many cases, woodland recommendations about species that are well adapted to that site. All right? So the good thing is it'll tell you many types of those are deep soils or or not deep soils, or high quality and things like that. So, okay, cooperating with neighbors to reach your goals, that's a key thing. And trying to identify your property. I wanted to have you do this later. As you draw a map of your property, try and divide it up into management units or habitat patches. And what I mean by that are, what are areas that are similar enough that they would be managed as a unit? Does that make sense? So you have an area that's like all old, it's an old field area. Well, that could be managed as one area. Whatever you do, you're going to do in that entire area. You may have an area that's larger woodland, mature trees. Well, that's different. Whatever you do in there is probably going to be different. I may have a lawn area that I want to convert to natural area. I may identify that as a unit so that, oh, this is an area I'm going to plant or I'm allowed to go to natural area. So that's going to be part of your map so that when you start looking at that, you can say, oh, these are the different things I have going on my property. And we can help you with that as we go along. And this is kind of what it looks like. This is the case study in the map in the book. This is the Nelson property, and you can see they have some mixed hardwoods, and this is actually up north. They had aspens, little aspen grove, and some mature hardwoods here, and a stream side riparian area back here, and then a bunch of lawn. So, this might be something that would look like this. You can identify some different areas. Okay, we're not going to get into tree ID, although if we have time, it's supposed to be warm today. If you'd like, we could probably pop out for lunch for a few minutes. If you want to do some very quick tree ID, we'll have to see how the time goes. Who here knows how to identify trees? Not you, Connie. I'm just kidding. Okay, well, there's some real basics to tree identification that, frankly, we can cover in 5 and 10 minutes that would get you on the road. And one thing I will mention is that we have a tree ID guide in Maryland. It's a 4-H guide. It's on our website, but I also purchased some of these books from Virginia. These are only $2 a piece, believe it or not, and it has a leaf key guide in it. It's a very good book, and they're for sale in the back there. So if you're looking for it's not a bad book. For $2, it's a steal. So just to consider. One thing the manual has you do is go out of your property once you identify those areas and kind of go through a series of activities that says, well, what are the types of vegetation that are in there? What are the 3 common species and 3 shrub species? So you just do the best you can, okay? And some of these activities you'll do and some of these you may not. Now, we're not going to talk a lot about logging here, except to say that if you're going to do any logging, it would be a good thing to contact a consultant forester, one of these foresters that are in that forester guide. And there is logging that can take place on smaller properties to accomplish certain objectives. It just has to be done in a very careful way, and the folks that are on that list, I think, could help you with that. All right? And there's a lot of equipment that's coming out these days. It's much smaller. This is actually an ATV type thing. There's not a lot of these around here, but there's a lot of change going on in the timber harvesting markets. All right, this is the part, my favorite part, because this is about ecology, all right? And a little bit about how the forest works and what happens, why do things happen the way they happen when you go out in the woods. And we're going to talk a little bit about succession and forestry, primarily. Amy's going to talk about wildlife stuff later after lunch, all right? So if you have any questions, just raise your hand. But what we did is we took a lot of information about ecology and forestry, and we kind of simplified it down into about 5 or 6 principles of ecology and succession, and then in forestry. And what we do is we give you a paragraph of information and have you go out and do an activity. We tried, we first started putting together this manual. You know how big it was? It was this big. And what we realized is we just need to give folks just enough to understand the basic concepts and principles so they can understand what's going on in the woods. So this is a couple of basic principles about forest succession. So who can tell me what succession is? Maybe just give me a definition. Anybody here? Any idea? Okay, sequential change of what?
Whatever it is, probably about such in this case, it would be sequential change in the tree species.
Okay. Yeah, it's a sequential change, kind of you can almost kind of predict it in vegetation communities over time, okay? as you leave them alone. And you've all seen this, right? In your time, there was an old agri-field that was abandoned, and what happened to it? Grew up. It went through various stages of succession and basically developed into a mature woodland, all right? So the thing is that as that process takes place naturally, and we have a lot of problem with invasive these days, the thing I want to tell you is that you can alter that process by going in there and doing one of three things. Okay. You can cut something, you can plant something, or you can do nothing at all. Okay, all the management activities are going to come down to one of those three things. All right? But you can alter the process by doing that. And the other issue there is that trees vary in their requirements for light. All right? Now I just want to show you a couple of examples here. And this is if you abandon an area, an old field, an ag field, for example, what happens is what comes in are trees that are very adapted to full sunlight. All right? And those would be things, I don't know if you identify some trees, but if you go into an area that's just coming back into forest, do you recognize some of the trees that are in there? Do you know any of the trees by name, perhaps? Or?
We've got walnuts everywhere.
Okay, walnut, poplar, sassafras, and yellow poplar is a sign of a very fertile site. When you have yellow poplar coming in, that's a site that you have very fertile soils. Sumac. In this case, we have tree of heaven is a big problem. Okay, black cherry would be another one.
Mulberries.
Mulberries, okay. And these are all sun-loving trees. What happens over time is that as these grow up, then your later successional species, like your oaks, your beech, and your maple, come in underneath because they're adapted to the low sunlight regime. And over time, they'll basically take over that forest. Especially, in many cases, those trees in that first type will be harvested at one time or another. So when you go into a forest and you have things like beech and maple and oaks, that's probably a fairly old forest. That's been around there for quite a while, hundreds of years more than likely. If you go into a forest and it's all like black cherry and red cedar, things like that, that's a very young forest that's just in the early process of succession. All right? Does that make sense? Pretty much? Okay, and this is just a sequential bunch of pictures that kind of show that development around here where you have red cedar. It's very common. Okay, you see them coming in? Little red cedar trees, they start to grow up. All right, then we also getting some hardwoods coming in there now. And a lot of these hardwoods and oaks and things like that are, all right, what happens over time is those sun-loving trees, in this case the red cedar, as those older, more later successional oaks and things come in, they grow up above them, shade them out, and they die. And many times you walk through woodlands around here, and what you'll see is spikes of old red cedar trees. If you look around, that was basically an old farm field or a pasture that came back, okay, and grew up into a natural woodland. So it's a relatively, younger area, okay? But this is what it ends up after, a longer period of time. Now, when we do things like tree planting, what we're really doing is we're pushing succession ahead. We're saying that we're picking some of the winners. And Donna's going to talk about that, but one of the advantages of tree planting is that in a lot of areas there are no oak trees around to provide seed. So one of the things about tree planting is actually trying to plant some of those trees so there's an actual seed source for the future. All right? And then harvesting basically pushes succession back. So those trees that are cut, many times they're going to sprout from the stump, and you're also going to have trees seed in. So you're pushing succession back, and then it's kind of ramping up again. And you're going to get a whole mix of things coming in at that point. So that's the process of succession. So what we're doing in management activities, in woodland management, is we're altering the process of succession by doing one of three things. What are they? Okay. Plant something, cut something, or do nothing at all. Okay? Let nature take its course. Now, that whole process of succession is there's certain species that we know that are very well adapted to full sunlight. We call them shade intolerant. In other words, they're intolerant of shade. They only grow in full sunlight. And you have a list here. Aspen, birches, red cedar, a lot of your pine species, yellow poplar, sycamore. Those need full sunlight. That's the only place you're going to find them. You're not going to find them growing in the shade of other trees. But you have a whole range of other ones like dogwood, hickories, red maple, a lot of your oaks. Okay? Now, a lot of your oaks will come in on the understory, but it's going to take them a while. They're not going to grow up, into the overstory until the canopy is removed and they get full sunlight. All right? So the way it looks is like this. So here we have a loblolly pine, all right? Is that a tolerant or an intolerant species? Intolerant. It's intolerant of shade, okay? All right? Here we have anybody know what this is? See a flowering shrub in the understory of a dense forest? American dogwood. That's shade tolerant, okay? How about sugar maple? Yeah, sugar maple is a great species because it's very shade tolerant. It'll grow in the shade, and it'll actually grow up through the forest and become dominant in the forest over time, unlike a lot of these others. It'll actually just kind of grow up through the woods. Now, we don't have a lot of sugar maple around here, but in terms of a shade intolerant species, it's a good one. And these are some of your oaks right here. This is a little small oak clear cut. They put out a lot of sprouts from the stump. And actually, it's interesting about oaks because you ever see going through the forest and you'll see these little oak trees on the ground? Well, the strategy for oaks is that they'll establish themselves as an acorn in the understory. They'll grow up, build up the root system a little bit, and then they'll die back to the ground. And then they'll grow up again, and they'll develop their root system even more. In many cases, that little seedling sprout, they're called, or little seedling you see that in the woods that may be this tall, may have a lot of branches on it. If you were to pull up the root could easily be this big. And its regeneration strategy is such that once that canopy is removed, either from a natural or whatever, for whatever reason, it gets full sunlight, it all of a sudden has all these root reserves and it just takes off. So that's how oaks regenerate. And that's why, when you cut a forest, that you have to have oak regeneration there ahead of time, otherwise oaks don't come back. And that's why a lot of forests just don't have any oaks. So the folks here who are, they're concerned about it, they have an old oak forest and there's nothing growing in the understory, that forest is not coming back into oak, probably, more than likely. Unless the sprouts are young enough that they can sprout. So, a couple other pictures. How your woodland develops is a function of these couple of things. Site quality, in other words, how good the fertile the soil is and all that, the history, and a lot of the practices. And the thing to remember is what's growing on your property right now in its woods has more to do with past land use activity than anything else. Just because it's all full of invasive species doesn't mean it won't grow a beautiful oak forest. It's full of those species because those, it was cut and those things were allowed to come in and all the seeds were there. So, does that make sense? Just because what's there is there because of past land use activity. And one thing I have here is that the other thing is that it's a function of the quality of the site. And this is kind of just a drawing to show you this, is that, and you probably noticed this, if you hike up if you're down at the bottom, down by the creek, and then you walk up a kind of a steep hill, do you notice a difference in the vegetation? Okay, the stuff at the bottom, you usually have the trees are taller, everything is more lush, and around here, in many cases, when you go up to the top of the hill, you get a lot of oaks and chestnut oak and scrubby pine trees, and that's because of the fertility of the site, because everybody's aging, a lot of people are aging here. What happens over time? Things go to the bottom, right? Okay? All right? Well, soil's no different, right? So that soil typically at the top of those hillsides is very thin, doesn't hold a lot of moisture, trees don't grow as well, so only certain trees that are adapted to those drier, more infertile sites grow there, and what you end up is very deep, high fertility soils down at the bottom that kind of other species are adapted to that. And you can see this here. This is a picture from South Mountain, out where I am. These are oaks, which are very adapted to those very infertile, dry sites at the top of these ridges, all right? And these are, anybody know what these yellow trees are? Yellow poplar. Okay, this is a fall picture. And yellow poplar is requires very fertile soils. And these are those soils that basically over time have collected down at the bottom of this hillside, okay? So you can kind of see that in the fall, a lot of cases around the Rattle Hills here. So one thing to think about in terms of the how your property might be laid out, to understand why those trees are growing where they're growing. Now, how about aspect? Aspect Anybody know what aspect is? Term?
Jelly tomato.
Huh? Something to do with jelly, right? No.
Yeah, jelly tomatoes.
Okay. It's the direction that the hillside is facing. All right? So if we have a south-facing slope, that means that hillside is facing to the south. Now, what do we know about the sun, right? It rises in the east. What's the hottest part of the day? Noon, which is the sun is facing south. Okay? And so south and west is the hottest, driest part. So for a hillside, and this is obviously facing north, what do you think is going to have more productive forest? A slope, assuming everything else is the same, the soils and all, a slope that's facing north or a slope that's facing south? South. Well, actually, you're wrong. because it's facing south, that means it's getting full sunlight. Okay? And it's getting less moisture. The moisture gets baked out of the soil. So a lot of these north-facing slopes, they have a lot more moisture, and trees, you tend to get more lush vegetation on a lot of north slopes. And that's why moss grows on the north side of a tree, right? I mean, there's some truth to that. Now, this is a very generality, but there's certain species, you're going to go to a south-facing slope, and you're going to find more oak species on steep ravines like this, compared, this is out in western Maryland, to a north-facing slope where you're going to find maybe more poplar and sugar maple and other trees.
Someday chestnut.
And someday chestnut. So does that make sense? You got to think what's happening on the ground. That soil is getting baked by that hot sun. And remember, moisture is very important for trees to be able to grow well. Okay? So we talked about a little bit about past land use. Okay? We talked a little bit about site quality here. All right? The other thing about site quality is Maryland, like a lot of places in the East, we developed, when European civilization came over, the 1600s, 1700s, and started establishing agriculture, those practices were not that great. And, okay, typically they would plow every year, and when you plowed one year and you allowed the fields to stay fallow over the winter, you get a bunch of rain, you lose a little bit of soil. The next year, they come along with the plow and they plow down 12 inches again, right? What happens over the course of 100 years? You're losing your soil, and estimates are that a lot of areas in Maryland, around Carroll County is probably no exception, anywhere from probably 12 to 18 inches of topsoil have been lost. And in many cases, we're in a region called the Piedmont. You see those red soils in the spring, a lot of times, a lot of farm fields, those real red soils. A lot of times they're red is because that's actually subsoil. A lot of that topsoil has been lost over time. So agricultural practices in the last century have greatly improved, since the 60s and things like that. But basically, yeah, that's what University Extension got involved with. A lot of that. This is like a port along the Chesapeake Bay, and this was that agrarian economy, and a lot of that topsoil was lost. So a lot of sites have actually lost some soil fertility over the years, and that's why conserving and trying to control erosion is real important. And this is an example. This is, you can tell if your property's been plowed by digging a hole, okay? Most of it probably has, unless it's poor enough that it was just pastured. And you dig a hole, you actually see a color change down about 12 inches. So that 12 inches is typically going to be darker where it was plowed, and then it gets, more red, and which is more clay and things like that below that. So you really want to protect that root mat. That's whatever you do, okay? That's the most important thing. Okay, forests are resilient. This is a sequence of photos that shows a forest up in the Allegheny Plateau of Pennsylvania, but something very similar has happened here over the past as well. People don't realize how affected forests have been by past land use, okay, or how resilient they are. So this was a clear cut in 1927. They removed all the trees. Actually, they used to make chemicals out of the wood, and so you had pretty much all the trees were gone. Which actually, believe it or not, this is a good thing because that means you get all that new growth coming up, and you get much higher quality forest that grows out as a result. But that's second to the point to see the sequence of photos as this forest developed. 1928, 10 years later, and we're going to follow these two cherry trees. 20 years later, see how dense it is? 30 years, and you can see it's naturally thinning out, right? okay? Now, you can accelerate that process by, human activity to do commercial thinnings. 40 years, I guess that's 50 years, 70 years, all right? Now, not all forests grow like this, okay? But the point is that many cases, if you go into a mature woodland and it's oak and things like that, that forest has probably been totally cleared for agriculture at one time, and it's probably regrown back at least once, and it's been harvested probably at least once. So this idea of, the primeval forest, I mean, these forests have been reestablished and harvested many, many times. And and forests are incredibly renewable. I think that's the message I want to leave with you. So, yeah.
Would you say that that's a healthy forest looking technique?
Well, it's all, in this case, I mean, it seems to be okay. At this point, these trees are getting to a point where there's probably going to be some type of harvest activity because you're getting a lot of natural mortality, obviously. And one of the things about forestry as a landowner, with larger tracts anyway, is to derive some income from the property. And rather than let the trees just die and fall to the ground, to harvest them, and then by doing that, you actually control the trees that are actually going to advance into the future. So you keep your higher quality trees. Now, this is very clear, right? There's not much understory. So if wildlife was an objective here, you would want to perhaps do some thinning that would open the canopy, perhaps drive some income, and then allow some more habitat to develop. But that would depend on the objectives of the landowner. Okay, a couple other principles of succession. Different successional stages provide different wildlife habitat, and every small woodlot doesn't contain every stage of succession. Well, you can create these things, and you're going to see this one later with Amy, but this is the thing to keep in mind. This is the different successional stages, but realize that different wildlife require different types of habitat. So if you want to have turkeys, you need big trees like this for them to roost in, but you also need openings like this where the young poults can find insects in the spring. So my point is that I'm interested in wildlife. Well, what kind of wildlife? Well, you can actually alter the habitat in your property, so it's kind of like build it and they will come, That's what it requires, and you can do these things by doing one of three things, right? Okay, yeah.
So if you deforest an area, can you predict the succession distribution of species that will result?
But, in general, I think you can.
Will it be close to the original distribution of species, or is it going to evolve?
What's original mean?
Whatever it started with, whatever. It's going to continue to change, I understand that. But is there some kind of stable types of species that are more indigenous, say, to this area that you would expect?
Yeah. Like you said, you'd come in more early successional species, but some of that depends on on the quality of the site. So like I said, if you had a high, dry site, very infertile, there's going to be different things that come in there than if you're down by a stream bottom where you have very fertile soils. Those are going to be very different species. So from that point of view, you would have an idea that would come in. Now, what confounds this whole thing in many cases is the aggressiveness of a lot of the invasives we have, because they can many times just come in. And the problem where invasives are most critical is in those early stages of succession. That's when you need to control them before they get themselves established. Because once you let them get established, then you're fighting an uphill
Is that
battle.
a big problem in Maryland?
Big problem. So different stages of succession, mature forest, old field, young forest. Okay, let's look at a few, those are succession principles. Let's look at a few forestry principles, all right? Tree size is not related to age. People think they see a big tree, they think it's an old tree. That's not necessarily true. Different tree species require different conditions, just like I said, right? If you have very fertile soils, you might see a lot of yellow poplar and walnut and northern red oak and things like that. If you're up on a hilltop, you might see chestnut oak and scarlet oak and black oak, stuff like that. Okay? If you're in an old field, it's going to come red cedar maybe come in, things like that. So it depends. And trees grow at different rates, and forests are three-dimensional. In other words, that's the big problem that many people mentioned here. I have a one-dimensional forest, right? I got trees up here and nothing else. You're supposed to have, a lower layer like this, herbaceous layer, kind of a mid-level layer, and then a canopy. That's a healthy forests, but many of our forests are extremely unhealthy, and there's absolutely no question that it's tied to deer overabundance. And even to deer overabundance. In other words, too many deer, they're browsing all the understory, so that when they browse things, that means that nothing actually over time gets up to here, right? And what you end up with is exactly what many people have. The only solution for that is to control the population of deer, and that gets to be very sticky in a lot of places where you have folks who don't understand why that's necessary. And some of the work I do is with suburban deer management, is with communities, talking with folks to educate them about what the options are for deer management. And what we tend to find is that when people understand how deer work, per se, and what works, they'll typically are more accepting of that. Now, there's some people that, just like when you get into issues of abortion and everything else, there's people that are very much so on their views, they're not going to change. But for the majority of people, they get the information, they say, hey, oh, now I see the reason why we have to control the deer. Even though I don't want to hunt the deer, I will allow folks in my community to do it. And that's what a lot of what's happening with suburban deer management. Okay? So let's look at forests. Okay, we got tree A and tree B. So which tree is older? A. Who thinks? What, B? Actually, they're the same age. Okay? And that's the process of competition as forests develop. Okay, because this forest was a clear cut, it was abandoned, and it grew up. But trees compete for water, light, and nutrients. Light being the most important. And the tree that can get up into the sunlight the quickest and the best is the winner. This is the loser. Okay? And that's what you see in a lot of forests. Now, for the most part, you see big trees. Now, in many cases, some of the forests here have been cut over, so some of the trees were cut and some weren't, so there might be a big outlier trees left. But for a forest that hadn't had much harvesting in it, those bigger trees and smaller trees, in many cases, are the same age. And it works kind of like this. So as this forest developed, this was the tree that was able to get up into the sunlight and become dominant in the canopy and steal all the sunlight. So when it comes to harvesting trees and cutting trees for firewood and things like that, in some cases, you don't want to remove like all the understory, but you want to get a mix. But you want to make sure that you definitely want to make sure you leave these dominant trees, at least some of them. Now that's in a commercial timber harvest, so we'll talk about thinning a little bit later. But the point is that it's a process of competition going on in the woods. It's a dynamic thing going on with the competition primarily for light. Does that make sense? Okay. So what do we do when we have trees that are competing for sunlight? The whole process of thinning is very simple, because what we're doing is we're cutting down certain trees. Oops. I guess I don't have that one. Oh. It should show a picture of it being open. Where all of a sudden the canopy's open, and that's allowing those trees that are left to grow and to take over that space. And then what they're going to do is they're going to use all those extra carbohydrates to put on diameter at a faster rate. All right, so think of a tree as kind of a factory. Okay, more leaves, more food, and then it's going to usually put that in excess carbohydrates into diameter growth. And that's why if you have a tree out in the middle of the lawn, what does it look like? It's real big, right? Because it kind of grew out, and it's just putting all that in diameter. In the forest, the density is keeping it constrained, all right? And when you open it up a little bit, you're allowing that tree that you leave to grow out and to put on diameter at a faster rate. All right? Okay, we talked about vertical stratification, about the problems with deer and so on. This is typical. You ever seen this? Okay. Not a good thing, all right? Trees reproduce from seeds or sprouts. You cut down a hardwood tree, what happens? Does it just die? You said it resprouts, right? I mean, that's their regeneration strategy, right? They grow sprouts from the base. Now, if you really want, those trees can develop into very good trees, no question. The biggest thing is you want to make sure you cut that stump within about 6 inches of the ground. Because if you don't, what's going to happen is that the tree is going to form those sprouts from stumps, from buds that are under the bark above the ground. And they'll grow for quite a while, but the problem is they're not below the ground tied into the root system. They're tied into the old trunk. And so after that rots, the tree falls over. So if you're, cutting trees and you want those trees to regenerate into a future forest, make sure you cut them out within 6 inches of the ground, and that'll force them to grow out of the basal part or the underground part of the tree. Now, pine trees don't sprout. Now, a lot of people don't know that. And there's one pine tree that does, but for the most they don't. So, this is what I was saying about invasives. Invasives are and they don't have to be exotic invasives. Grapevine is a very tough invasive. And the recommendation for that, I'll maybe show you this later, but this is a great tool. It's called a sandvick or a brush axe. This is one of the best things for cutting grapevines because it's balanced, and surveyors use it. I used to do a lot of surveying. And you use brush axe. It has a sharp blade on it. You carry a file with you. And you cut grapevines. Now, you don't cut all the grapevines, but you cut the grapevines out of any of the trees that you want to be in the future canopy, because if you don't, they collect ice and snow. And what did you see with these hurricanes we have? It drags those trees down to the ground. So grapes are great because they provide wildlife food for turkeys and birds, but you want to keep them constrained to trees that you really don't care about. And I was telling somebody, I own about 220 acres of forest land in West Virginia, and we actually paid a group of wild West Virginians to go through the woods, and they cut all the grapevines off. Not every one, and the result has been we have a beautiful forest because the trees grow faster because they're not stressed out from all the extra weight. And with all these ice and snowstorms, while what people adjacent to us have lost incredible amounts of blowdown and ice and trees falling down, we've lost next to nothing. So controlling grapevines and other vines, not just grapevines, the invasives as well as the, what do you call it?
Are those edible grapevines? Grapes are edible?
Yeah, well, I don't know. The birds like them. I guess you could eat them. I don't know.
They're too small to bother.
They're kind of, and you got to get up there to,
There's a whole lot more seed than there
yeah,
is grape.
yeah. If you want grapes, go to the store, grow your own.
Grow a table grape.
That's right, and you can use the vines to make, grapevine wreaths and stuff like that. So, but this early successional stage is when a lot of these things really need to be controlled, and you actually have a chance of controlling them. Because once they get established, it just becomes overwhelming. All right, invasive exotic species. I'll talk a little bit about this later, but this is the big issue right now. Who's here heard of emerald ash borer? Emerald ash borer is an invasive bug, and basically most of the state is quarantined at this point. And we'll probably maybe talk a little about this later, but if you have ash trees, and this is my personal opinion of a number of people, the proactive thing at this point probably is if you have, you want to need firewood or things, would be to cut out grape ash trees. Because typically they're probably going to die at some time in the future. That's what's happened in other states that have been Ohio and Michigan, and not just in the woods. And the thing is, in Maryland, we don't have that much ash in the woods. But if you have big ash trees, you may want to seriously consider about removing them, especially if they're close to the house, if I were you. But you can always wait, but it's always deal to deal. And the same thing occurred with gypsy moth back in the 80s. Once a tree dies, oak trees die, there's not much you can do about it. They don't resprout. So we lost a lot of oaks in our woodlands because of gypsy moth. If they had been cut prior to that and resprouted, they would have survived in the forest. But once they die, they just don't resprout. So emerald ash borer, gypsy moth, there's a lot of threats. And one reason for learning more about your woods is to see what you might have that's problematic in your woods. So when it comes time to cut firewood, well, maybe this ash tree is a good tree to take down because why don't I let this, release this oak tree over here and let that grow? Because I know that's going to probably exist into the future. And we have there's a lot of information out there on invasive species. We could talk a whole day about it, but you should educate yourself about some of this and learn what some of these things look like. We'll talk about wildlife later, but the biggest thing, and a lot of people are very used to controlled things that look well. The biggest issue with wildlife habitat and with forestry is getting people to realize that messy is okay. If it's not messy, there's no habitat. This is actually looking at my house through my back woodlot, okay? That's great habitat. In the middle of the winter, there's places in there for wildlife, birds and mammals to hide. If it's a bare open ground, it's open to predators and not much is going to be protected. So that's a thing that people, a mindset that people have to get over, coming from your more European manicured lawn outlook. We talked a little about wildlife. A lot of things we're talking about where you create habitat, you're probably creating habitat for deer as well. So one thing I would tell you is that in Maryland, there's a lot of people that are allowing bow hunting on these smaller acreage properties. And by law, you're supposed to be 150 yards from an occupied dwelling to hunt. But if you have the permission of your neighbors, that can be reduced to 0. So many people are working with their neighbors and allowing bow hunters. Bow hunters not going to shoot more than 20 or 30 yards. I mean, from a tree stand and so on. And that's a way to control some of these deer and some of these large acreage developments. Something to think about. Okay, well, the Timetable goes through a bunch of different assessments and has you go out and look at wildlife. So these are these different units that we identified, okay? So one of them we go through and says there's large oak and hickory for hard mass. And we'll talk later about what mast is, but mast is just trees that produce nuts or soft fruits that are used by wildlife, okay? So one of the things I really hope that you come out of this course with is going out in the woods and opening your eyes and saying, oh, those are some wildlife elements. Those are mast trees. That's a snag. That's a dead tree that provides habitat for woodpeckers. That's a rock pile. I mean, that's good for small mammals and snakes. Now, maybe you don't want snakes. So, recreation aesthetics. Small footpaths go to the stream in the back. Many deer trails. Old fire circle. A lot of people have smaller acreage properties and may develop a little clearing back in the woods where they actually have a little camping area. That type of thing. Okay, so here we are. We've done this self-assessment of your property. You've learned some things. Okay, you get a better understanding of why trees are, how the vegetation perhaps is developing the way it does. You say, well, what are some projects I can do? All right. Well, what we do is we say, these are some of those resource objectives that we identified: natural area improvement, forest products, and wildlife habitat. These are some of the projects that people typically undertake to reach some of those objectives. So, for example, natural area improvement. I have a grassy field or lawn I want to plant in trees, and we ask you to pick out what are some of those potential objectives, and then rank them, 1, 2, and 3. What are the most important ones that I really want to do? So we're kind of feeding you things that this sounds good, and then you can look at it. And what we've really done as a forester, we're taking a lot of forest management activities and wildlife management activities that we've worked with on larger acreage landowners for years and trying to scale them down, in a sense, to smaller properties. So this is not new stuff, It's kind of more of what's been out there. But we're taking common forest management techniques. I don't have any snags for wildlife. I don't have any snags for woodpeckers. What do I do about that? I'd like to have some woodpeckers. Well, I can go out there and girdle a tree that I don't want, and that tree will die, and it will turn into a snag for wildlife. Okay? And I go do some firewood thinning and stuff like this. I could plant some trees, use them in certain areas. I don't have to plant trees on a 10 by 10. I could just plant some trees to get some more genetics and some oaks and things that aren't present out there into the forest, and then allow natural regeneration to come back. There's a lot of different options. So if you are going to, the biggest thing in the forest, you have to learn to look up, because that's where all the action is, that's where the light is. Trees are in a constant, dynamic fight for the light. That's what it's all about. And who here uses a chainsaw? Okay. Biggest thing is to learn how to use it safely. I have 35 stitches above this leg because I didn't want to put my protection on one day. And so luckily I was okay, but you'd be surprised how deep 1.5 teeth can go. If it had been 2 teeth, I'd probably call me Stumpy, okay? All right. So learn how to use stuff quickly or safely. What we also provide you in this case study is examples, because this is all new to people. Well, okay, I want to plant trees, but how do I do that? So we have some examples there for the Nelson family. I want to convert this lawn to trees. These are the steps that you go through to do it. Now, would anybody write this out? Most people wouldn't know enough, but the point of the way you learn is by looking at what other people have done. So we provide you the case study, and then there's some additional case studies in there for different examples. So in this case, it says, to convert to trees, I'm going to use Roundup herbicide in the grass in the fall before planting in the spring. Use trees and shrubs that flower, have great fall color. Now, buy some seedlings. Where do you buy tree seedlings? Munsters? Arbor Day, okay. Well, you have a state source of great seedlings at a very reasonable price. The Maryland DNR Forest Service has a state forest nursery, all right? And if you go online and type DNR Forest Nursery, Maryland DNR Nursery, I don't know if you have a planting guide here, seedling guide?
There's a flyer
Oh, okay.
that has a list of species and the website.
Okay. Very affordable. And what they do is typically you go online, it's all online, you pay for the seedlings, and if you want them, you better do it. You should do it now, if it's not too late already.
Because they sell out.
They sell out, and what they do is then I think they send you a card. When they pull the seedlings, they actually send you a card that they're going to be there in a few days, so you can be ready to plant them when they
I
come.
looked at the website yesterday, and there are a number of them that are sold out.
Yeah.
And we've gotten those seedlings, oaks primarily, and gone to the expense of buying those tubes
Yeah.
to protect them, and they didn't live. So, you know, we've got the deer, we tried the tubes. Are those tubes, I see them all over the place. Are they a good thing to do or not?
Well, they are, and maybe we should talk about, Donis can talk about that, but yeah, sometimes, when you have droughts and other things, they do die, you have to replant.
Are the tubes, I mean, do they typically work to, I mean,
Well, they'll stop the deer, but
well, they'll stop the deer, but the trees never seem to emerge above the tubes.
That's a water issue probably.
is it possible that maybe, I mean, there's no question that sometimes they don't. And I'm not sure what to say, except that it depends on the species and other things. Maybe Donna has some comments when she talks about tree planting, but.
One of my big things is competition. Grass,
No,
grass,
it wasn't, no competition.
Okay.
I mean, not that kind of,
no grass around the trees.
no. In the woods, in empty spaces.
Well, there may not have been enough. What kind of species was it?
It's primarily oak hickory.
Okay, but what did you?
Oaks we planted.
Okay, well, it's very difficult to plant oaks in the forest many times and get them to live, because there's not enough sunlight in many cases for them to really survive. Most of those shelters are best used when you're out in open fields. When you plant seedlings in the forest, it's especially in a dense forest, it's very difficult. That's probably why they died.
Is there any real point to doing that?
Well, there's a lot of people that it's called underplanting to get some more genetics back into the forest, but it's not highly successful in a lot of cases. Where it's successful is most cases where they've done a thinning, where they've removed some of the canopy, so there's a lot of sunlight coming in. Trying to just go out into a native forest that's been unthinned, plant some seedlings and tree tubes out there. I seriously doubt that's probably why they died.
Can I say something
Yeah.
about this? Water. All the big trees have miles and miles and miles of roots and millions of miles of root hairs under there that you're planting your seedlings in, and those developed trees are going to take the water. So, I mean, really, the major reason that seedlings don't succeed is lack of watering.
Well,
Yeah, I mean,
I don't know. We could argue on that, but I think in many cases you're right when that comes out into more open field plantings. But I think still in the dense woods, that's probably part of it. You're right, but I think a good part of that's going to be shade as well. But that's probably one reason. Maybe try watering them. Maybe that'll help. Replant them and plant them. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the normal understory type things do, I mean, I've got woods, they're oak hickory,
but things like pawpaws and red buckeyes and things like that that are normal understory, those have done well for me when I've planted those in my woods.
Okay. Just as a basic, underplanting is tough. Okay, we're at the break time and we're done here pretty much, but the one thing I will tell you, whatever activity you should do is make a photographic record. One suggestion is to actually have a photo point. That every year or so, whatever, take a picture from that point. And you'd be surprised how you can see how things change. Okay, so at this point, what we're going to do is take a break. We got about 10, 15 minutes, and we're going to come back, and what I want to ask you to do is if you wouldn't mind maybe getting into groups of like 4 or 5 people, okay? And then we'll give you something, I'll give you some information when we come back, okay?